There is not a man or a beast, nothing on the land or underneath, oh, nothing that could ever come between the love you have for me.
I want to start this morning with a question. I'm going to get you interacting once again. I know it's Minnesota, you hate that. So I'm going to ask you a question and have you discuss with people next to you, and then I'm going to ask for a few responses back. What is one thing that you've spent a lot of time on that ended up being nothing more than a waste of time? Something you did that in the end was just a waste of time. Why don't you talk to people next to you, like one or two people, and then I'll ask for a few responses. And I'm going here first. All right, 30 more seconds. All right, it sounds like it's winding down a little bit. Maybe like 3 people. What's something you did that ended up just being nothing more than a waste of time? You can just call out if you want.
It's like Lamaze, those labor and delivery classes. They teach you all this stuff, and then you're in there, and it's like, whatever. That's a waste of time and money.
I purposely know nothing about that. My wife does, but not me. Maybe 2 more. Lamaze. Who can beat Lamaze?
Hoping our sports teams would take us to the Super Bowl.
Especially if you're from Minnesota. Or it doesn't have to be the Super Bowl in Minnesota. Anything, right? All right, one more person. Something that is nothing more than a waste of time.
I feel like I did a lot because I had like a lot of examples when I spoke to him earlier, but I made him housewarming presents of this game, and I never finished them. I made a dress, never finished that. And a website for my portfolio, never finished that.
All right, so lots of unfinished projects.
Yes.
Good. I don't know about you, but I hate wasting time. Wasting time and energy on things that aren't going to turn out, especially the way that I think they ought to. I want nothing to do with those things. And I would imagine that most of you would agree with that. And as we look at the Gospel of Mark, we've been studying it for the last several weeks, we see that Jesus isn't really into wasting time much either. If you're familiar with the Gospel of Mark, Mark does not even include a Christmas story. Matthew and Luke each include like these extended sections, several chapters introducing us to this Jesus before he's even born. Mark doesn't do that. There's some introduction to who Jesus is, but immediately he goes to his ministry, and he's going from place to place, person to person, story to story, quickly. He's doing these healings, he's making these different pronouncements, but he's doing them while he's on the go. And so we can almost get the perspective that, well, Jesus isn't much for wasting time either, and his ministry is very short. He's got to get all of these important things done as quickly as possible. He's wanting to be productive, and to slow down, to waste time on something or someone would be counterproductive to his very important ministry. There's only a couple places in the Gospel of Mark where he actually slows down a little bit. One of them we looked at last week. There's only 2 major sermons in the Gospel of Mark, and one of them we looked at last week. And yet, as soon as he finishes his sermon, he keeps going somewhere else. And so we come to chapter 5 this morning, and there's 2 different stories that we're going to read from this morning. Joy read one of the 2, and it seems like these stories might be interconnected, maybe not. They happen to be spliced together, but it's really going to challenge us to understand what it means for us to slow down or to be bothered by something, because as it turns out, Jesus in his very chaotic ministry is going to be bothered by something. And so as we wrap our heads around these stories, as we find ourselves in this season of Epiphany, we're looking at these and asking, what does this reveal to us about God, and what does this challenge of us? And so the story begins in Mark chapter 5, 21 through 43. And actually, before I get to that, super important, which doesn't often get addressed, I need to talk to you about shame and honor, which might seem completely counterproductive to reading these stories. And yet, what I think is most important is this, because if we understand shame and honor specifically in first century Palestine, we're going to read these stories completely differently than we might otherwise. Now, I'm not sure how familiar people are with honor and shame, because in the Western world we tend to think about guilt rather than shame. And guilt is often this internal feeling that we can get of indebtedness. And it's often a result of things that we have done. So we have this internal feeling of guilt and indebtedness. Shame it can be internalized, but it's often externalized. This painful feeling of not only you may have done something wrong, but there's something wrong with you. Shame and the opposite of honor. Honor is tied to social standing, to worth. And so if you have honor, you have social standing, you have worth, you can say, perhaps, I am good, not just I do good things. On the other hand, there's shame. And if you are shameful or you do shameful things, you lose your worth. You lose your social standing. And so these things are constantly in play. Honor and shame. You want to be honorable. You want to avoid shame or shameful things at all costs. Now, you might be wondering, how does someone, particularly in first century Palestine, where Jesus would have been, get honor or shame? Mostly, honor is something that you're born with or is given to you because of privilege. Most people who are in privileged positions receive honor because that was the position they were given or the position they were born into. It's particularly emphasized in gender. A man is born with honor, and it holds the honor kind of corporately as a society, because honor is not just about an individual, but it includes many more people as well. And so men were seen as the bearers of honor in the first century. Contrast to that were women. You can guess what they were the bearers of. They were symbolizing shame. They could gain honor by doing certain things, perhaps, or by being given that honor by men. How nice. And so, again, there's this constant tension of honor and shame. You want to be honorable and not shameful. And honor and shame can be depending on your interactions and your actions with people. And so you can be honorable but do shameful things and thus be shamed. Less frequently, you can be shameful and do something honorable and perhaps gain some of that honor. But basically, the idea was you want to be honorable all the time, and so you want to do everything you can to protect your honor, which seems super fragile. And yet that's the culture. That's the culture of many places around the world today as well, but particularly in first century Palestine. This honor and shame were things constantly in play, in actions, in interactions. And again, you might be wondering, what on earth does this have to do with this story? And I want to argue it has everything to do with this story and with these stories, because what Jesus does is he confronts honor and shame and says, I'm going to completely level the playing field. And I'm going to do it by my interactions and my actions. So now we can get to Mark 21. If you have your Bibles, you can turn with me. Otherwise, it's going to be up here on the screen. I'll be reading from the New International Version, in case you're familiar or unfamiliar with that. And actually, this begins right in the middle of... the next section begins in the middle of a verse. All right, 21 and following. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." And so, Jesus went with them. I'm going to stop right here. I'm actually going to break this whole section up into 3 different smaller sections. And the first thing we hear is that Jesus is crossing over to the other side of the lake. You can almost imagine this in terms of going over to the other side of the train tracks. That's kind of a euphemism that gets used in our time. He has just been over in Gentile territory, non-Jewish territory. And so he crosses over to the other side of the lake where things are maybe going to be a little bit safer because they're around people that he knows, people that are like him. And when he arrives, as we've been taught by Mark to expect, he's met by crowds. If you've been here over the past several weeks, crowds doesn't just refer to a great number of people, but it refers to a quality of people. These aren't rich and the famous. These are everyday, normal, commoner people, many of them poor and oppressed, and they're coming to Jesus, flocking to him, hoping that some sort of interaction with them is going to change their lives for the better. So he gets to the other side of the lake. He's met by these crowds, these normal, everyday people, nameless and perhaps faceless, and yet from the crowds emerges this man, synagogue leader. Now, at this time, synagogue leaders would have been one of the most prominent people in a town, one of the most wealthy as well. Not only were they in charge of the synagogue buildings, but they were in charge of the worship. And so they would have been well known, very prominent, very honorable, you might even say. To the point where we even hear the synagogue leader's name, which is almost unheard of in healing stories. He gets a name, Jairus. This is how honorable he is. We need to know his name. Everybody else would already know his name. He emerges from these crowds of likely dishonorable, shameful people, normal, everyday citizens, and he comes before Jesus because his daughter is dying. He is desperate for something to happen. And so what he does is he falls on his face before Jesus. He does the honorable thing in the first century Palestine, acknowledging the honor of the person that he's coming to. He falls before Jesus and says, "Jesus, my daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." He's got nothing else that he can do. He's desperate. He falls before Jesus. And Jesus responds with, "All right, I'll go." And so, reading this in the context of honor and shame, we might say, well, this Jairus guy is a very honorable man in the first century in this town, and he's done the honorable thing, and so Jesus is responding as an honorable person would do, and he's going to take care of this Jairus. There's a little caveat, though, as we continue the story. And we pick it up in the middle of verse 24. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. This is Jesus on his way to visit Jairus' daughter. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now, last week we were looking at the parable of the sower, and in the middle of the parable of the sower, there's a little kind of interjection that really hits at the point of the story. It doesn't necessarily come at the end. It comes right smack dab in the middle. This is something called an intercalation. Last week I called it a sandwich. So the meat of it is right in the middle rather than at the end. And once again, Mark is doing something here. He's in the middle of telling the story about Jairus and his daughter, and he interrupts it with this story about this woman. Notice the contrast between Jairus, this rich synagogue ruler, and this nameless woman. She doesn't get a name. She's been hovering among the crowds because she can't be seen. She is a woman. She is automatically lower on the totem pole. She automatically has some level of shame. But beyond that, she has a condition where she's bleeding. Most scholars think that this is a menstrual condition that for 12 years she's been suffering from. And one of the things that there's lots of very good things about translations, and there's things that just don't translate very well other times. It's not as easy to pick up in any English translation, but in Greek, there are 7 participles that follow to tell this story of this woman. Participles are ing verbs, so they're ongoing. For 12 years, Mark is saying, she's been doing everything possible to set herself free from this condition, and she's lost everything in the process, and rather than it getting better, it has gotten worse. She's shameful because she's a woman. She's shameful because she's bleeding. She's shameful because she can't get it to stop. And because of those things, she's a social outcast, probably on the outskirts of town, to the point where when Jesus comes and there's crowds, she has to sneak through the crowd to get to him. She's so different from Jairus. And yet, she does the exact same thing. She's so desperate that she comes to him with the faith that he can do something for her. And she sneaks through the crowd, she reaches out, and she touches him, and in that instant, she's healed. Not just from her condition, but from her suffering, because suffering is more than just physical pain. A few weeks ago, we talked about Jesus going and visiting a tax collector's home, which was just absurd, because a tax collector going into your home would make everything in your home unclean. And yet Jesus went into this home, and in going into a tax collector's home, declared the entire home clean. This woman, navigating through the crowd, reaching out and touching Jesus in a shameful way, rather than bowing before him, should have made Jesus unclean, and yet the opposite is true. She is freed from her condition, and she's freed from her suffering. And notice what Jesus does. He's on a mission to an honorable person's house who's done an honorable thing, and he stops. And he starts looking around. And his disciples are apoplectic. You're being followed by all of these people pushing up against you. Someone touches you, and now you're asking the question of, who touched me? Why would you bother with that? And perhaps in the back of their minds, they may have even knew who it was. And not only why would you bother with that, but why would you bother with her? And yet Jesus stops. He finds the woman. The woman comes before him. She recognizes that she's done perhaps the shameful thing. She falls before him. She acknowledges what she's done. And Jesus doesn't ridicule her. He doesn't shame her. He doesn't say, I was on my way to do something important and you interrupted me. Instead, he says, daughter. This shameful woman with a shameful condition who did shameful things is suddenly lifted up as daughter. Your faith has healed you. And in that moment, he lifts her up to a social standing far beyond anybody who's currently following him. In the chapter that precedes this one, Jesus' closest followers are called out for not having faith. And yet this shameful woman who's done this shameful thing and has this shameful condition is elevated because of her faith. Her faith has healed her, regardless of whether she did the honorable thing. Which brings us back to, what about the other daughter? What about Jairus' daughter? And again, we continue the story in 35 and following. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came to the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brothers of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they all laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha Kayum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So in the interruption, Jesus gets interrupted again by the people coming from Jairus' house and is told, your daughter's dead. Don't bother this Jesus anymore. It would just be yet another interruption. And yet, once again, Jesus responds very differently. Many of the translations say, overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." This can also be translated, ignoring what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He doesn't care what they have to say. He doesn't think they are bothering him. The situation is not hopeless, and he continues to go about his business anyways. He goes to Jairus' house. He clears the house of everybody else. And notice he does a shameful thing. Something he's not supposed to do. He touches someone who's dead, which again was supposed to make him unclean. And in doing that, instead, he made the girl clean and brought her back to life. Something everybody else was laughing about. Why would he bother with this situation? Again, he flips the narrative. He flips what is right and wrong. He flips what is shameful or unshameful, and again raises up Jairus' faith in this very tenuous situation. By the way, how old is the girl? 12. Mark just kind of throws that in there. 12 years of prominence, and yet she's on her deathbed. 12 years of shame. She's got nothing left to give, and yet they both come to Jesus, regardless of their position, regardless of whether it is deemed an interruption or not. They come to him and say, "We have no other way of going forward." And Jesus responds by accepting the interruption. As we go through this season of Epiphany and we continue to look at, well, what does Jesus reveal to us about God? What does he reveal to us about us? We see very clearly what he's revealing to us about who God is and what God values. Perhaps the entire good news of the kingdom is about these holy interruptions. In Jesus, we see a God who interrupts his own life. He interrupts his own will. He interrupts his own possibilities. While he could have remained distant from this broken world, he came into it as a poor person, announcing the good news to the people who needed it most. In Jesus, we see a king of holy interruptions. He doesn't stand distant from the crowds. He doesn't stand distant from shameful people. Instead, he interacts with them and sees it as an opportunity to reveal the kingdom in and among them, and perhaps even through them. And in Jesus, we see a healer who enjoys holy interruptions. He doesn't care how impossible the situation seems. He steps into it while everybody else says, "Why bother?" It says, "But faith." Your faith has healed you. regardless of your honor, regardless of your shame. I will interact. So perhaps these holy interruptions were actually part of the good news all along, and they're confrontations with the things that we might otherwise say, why bother? Hopeless situations, hopeless people, these larger societal effects that we might otherwise step away from, Jesus steps into and calls us into as well. Because as followers of Jesus today, our situation is perhaps not that different. There are things by which we could easily say, why would we even bother? As we look at our broken worlds, perhaps even our broken spheres of influence, there are things that are just not the way that they should be. There's pain and mourning and oppression and death, and we could easily say these things are out of our control. Why on earth would we bother dealing with them? If you're familiar at all with statistics that are coming up about Christianity, church attendance is declining quickly. And so the thought of starting a new church to try to gather new people on a new mission in a new community might seem absolutely absurd. Why on earth would you start a new church? Why would you bother to start a new church when all these other ones are closing? And particularly in Richfield. Let's be honest, Richfield resident, it's not a flashy place. It's not necessarily a growing place either. Why not, if you're going to plant a church, do it in a community with flashy things, flashy people? Why bother here? And on top of that, there are these big, larger things that we could easily say, why bother? Racism and sexism and human trafficking and police brutality and terrorism. We could easily look at these things and say, the world is not as it should be. I don't think we can do anything about them. Why would we bother? And yet, I believe that Jesus is saying into each and every one of those questions, because faith, because me. As followers of Jesus, our faith drives us to believe that healing is possible, to believe that gathering new followers of Jesus in new places is possible, to interact with people who might not be flashy, to continue gathering and pouring into people who might not be flashy, or places that might not be flashy, and ultimately to look at these larger societal things and also say, we believe that transformation, that renewal, that healing is possible and important. And so as a church, as followers of Jesus, whether you're part of this local congregation or not, may we be the type of people who never say, why bother? May we be the type of people who instead say, because faith. Will you join me in praying? God, we look at our lives, we look at our communities, we look at our world, and see a place where we could easily say, and we know other people have already said, why would you bother? Why would you bother with this place? Why would you bother with those people? Why would you bother with this situation? But God, we know that you speak hope into hopeless situations. You speak help to helpless people. And you speak healing where it seems like healing is not possible. So God, we ask for that in our lives. We ask that for us in our communities, and we ask that in our world. We trust you.